At the top of a mountain on the tri-border of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, there is a ruined stone temple. It sits at 9,232 feet, the highest ancient temple ever documented. In 1869, a British explorer reached that summit and found a limestone inscription inside. He broke it in two and carried it to the British Museum, where it remains today. The translation is still disputed. A book excluded from your Bible named this exact mountain as the site where 200 non-human beings landed. They swore an oath and began breeding with human women. The text is 2,000 years old. The mountain is still there. That book is called First Enoch. And before you decide what it is, you need to understand what it survived. The ruins at the summit are called Qasr Antar. No modern archaeological team has excavated them. The summit is under Syrian military control. A UN buffer zone surrounds the mountain between Israeli and Syrian positions. The last formal survey of what sits on that peak was Warren's visit in 1869, over 150 years ago. The broken stele he removed is in London. The temple it came from is beyond reach. And the text that named that summit as a landing site was buried in a desert cave for 2,000 years before anyone found it. This is where the case begins, not with theology, with a mountain, a missing stone, and a text that refuses to read like fiction. In 1952, archaeologists working in the Judean desert near the Dead Sea opened a cave at Qumran, Cave 4. What they found inside changed the picture of ancient religious literature permanently. Among the scrolls were fragments of a text that most people in the Western world had never heard of, because it had been excluded from the Bible centuries before. But the Qumran community had not excluded it, they had copied it. 11 times in Aramaic, more copies than the biblical books of Esther, Chronicles, or Nehemiah. The fragments were dated paleographically to 200 to 150 BCE. The text was old, the community treated it as essential, and the text pointed north, to a mountain. The book is First Enoch, the book of the Watchers, and here is the first thing you need to understand. The full text does not exist in Hebrew. It does not exist in Greek in complete form. The only surviving complete version is in Ethiopic, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia, preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which is the only Christian tradition that never removed First Enoch from its canon. The Aramaic original was lost for centuries. What the Qumran fragments proved in 1952 was that the Aramaic version had existed, and that it was old enough to predate the New Testament by at least 200 years, which creates an immediate problem, because the New Testament quotes it. Jude 1:14-15, a canonical epistle. The author writes, Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied, saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all. That is a word-for-word passage from First Enoch, not a paraphrase, not an echo, a direct quotation attributed to Enoch with full prophetic authority. And 2 Peter 2:4 uses a Greek verb, tartarou, that appears nowhere else in the New Testament. It means to cast into Tartarus. The passage describes God not sparing angels who sinned, but casting them into chains of darkness. The only extended ancient text that describes that event in detail is the book that was excluded from the Bible. They kept the quotes. They removed the source. Now read what the source actually says. 1 Enoch chapter 6. The text opens mid-scene. A group of beings called the Iron Aramaic, for the vigilant ones, the awake ones. The watchers are described as seeing the daughters of men and desiring them. Their leader, Shemihaza, is concerned. He says he fears he will be the only one punished if the plan fails. So they do something unusual for a symbolic vision. They take a vote. They make a group decision. They swear an oath together, 200 of them. And then the text says this: They descended on the summit of Mount Hermon in the days of Jared, and they named it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves with mutual imprecations upon it. Stop there. The mountain does not just appear in the text as a setting. The mountain is named after the event. The text provides the etymology. Mount Hermon in Hebrew, Har Hermon from the root Haram, meaning oath, ban, or curse. According to 1 Enoch, the mountain received that name because of what 200 beings swore there. This is not how mythology typically operates. Mythology does not usually embed an etymology into a geographical location and then name 20 of the participants. Chapter 6 to 7-8 lists them. Shemihaza, the leader. Artakoff, Remeshel, Kokabel, Armumahel, Ramiel, Daniel, Zikkel, Barakel, Asael, down through the ranks. 20 leaders, each commanding 10. This is a roster. Not a metaphor for evil. A list of names and ranks at a named location after a specific event. That is not how symbols work. That is how field reports work. Now look at what they did when they arrived. 1 Enoch chapter 8. The text gets specific in a way that should make you uncomfortable. Each watcher is assigned a domain of knowledge. Each one is named. Each one is described as teaching specific subjects to humans who had not possessed them before. Azazel, the second figure, taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them. He taught the use of antimony. He taught how to beautify the eyelids. He taught ornaments and costly stones and coloring tinctures. Barakijal taught astrology. Ezekiel taught the signs of the clouds. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. Semjaza taught enchantments and the cutting of roots. Read that list again. This is a curriculum. Metallurgy, weaponry, cosmetics, astrology, sorcery. Each teacher is named. Each subject is named. This is not a theological statement about the nature of evil. This is a transfer of knowledge record, an educational transaction. Specific instructor, specific knowledge, specific recipient. If you found this document with no religious framing, you would call it a historical record of instruction, and then God responds. And the response is just as specific as the crime. 1 Enoch chapter 10. God instructs the archangel Raphael to bind Azazel. The exact language: bind him hand and foot, cast him into the darkness. Make an opening in the desert, which is in Dudale, and cast him therein. Place upon him rough and jagged rocks. Cover him with darkness. Cover his face, so he may not see light. And let him abide there until the great day of judgment, when he shall be cast into the fire. An opening in the desert. Rough and jagged rocks, covered in darkness, face blocked from light. This is not a theological concept. This is a site description, a coordinate set. A location in a specific place called Dudael with specific physical features. Surface material, light conditions, containment structure. Whoever wrote this was not describing an abstraction. He was describing somewhere, a real desert, a real rock opening, a real pit with rough material on top of it. The mainstream explanation is that this is borrowed Tartarus language. Greek cosmological underworld imagery absorbed into Jewish apocalyptic literature. The passage is symbolic, not spatial, and that explanation is defensible until you look at another text that uses the same word. Leviticus 16, canonical scripture. The Day of Atonement. Aaron selects 2 goats. One is sacrificed to God, the other is sent alive into the wilderness. And the passage names the destination, Azazel, the same name, 3 times in the same chapter. Some translations render Azazel as scapegoat, a generic term for the ritual. But that translation is disputed. Scholars genuinely disagree about whether Azazel in Leviticus is a location, an abstract concept, or a being. If Azazel is the same figure imprisoned in Dudael in 1 Enoch, and that connection was made by serious scholars, not fringe interpreters, then the Day of Atonement ritual takes on a completely different shape. Israel's sins are not wandering randomly into the desert. They are being returned to the figure who first introduced corruption. The goat carries the debt back to its source. The Qumran community, the same people who buried 11 copies of 1 Enoch in the desert, lived in the cliff and canyon geography that the scapegoat ritual pointed toward. They knew both texts. They kept both texts. And they wrote them down, together, in the same cave system, near the same desert terrain. That does not prove that Dudael has been found. No archaeological team has identified it. The location remains unknown, but the pattern is what matters. The punishment in 1 Enoch uses desert geography, rock material, light conditions, and a named location. The ritual in Leviticus uses the same name, points toward the same desert direction, and is part of the same ancient tradition being preserved by the same community. One detail could be coincidence. The whole configuration starts to feel like a map. Now back to the mountain. In 1869, Sir Charles Warren climbed to the summit of Mount Hermon as part of a survey for the Palestine Exploration Fund. At 9,232 feet, in the ruins of what would prove to be the highest known ancient temple in the world, he found a limestone stele, a slab. He broke it in 2 pieces to carry it down. He took it to the British Museum, where it remains. The Greek inscription was later translated by scholar George Nicholsberg, one of the leading experts on 1 Enoch, to read, "According to the command of the greatest and holy God, those who take an oath proceed from here." Nicholsberg formally connected this inscription to 1 Enoch 6-6, the oath on the summit, the naming of the mountain, the event the whole tradition describes as the beginning of the corruption of the earth. A stone at the summit. About an oath, at the exact location the text names as the oath site. But the stele contains a problem, a significant one. The British Museum translation differs from Nicholsberg's. The difference is one Greek word, "au," meaning not. In the competing translation, the inscription reads, "Those who do not take the oath," which would change the direction of the monument entirely from a memorial to the oath-takers to a warning against those who refuse the oath. Scholars have not resolved this. The translation is genuinely disputed, and the stele is no longer at the site, so direct re-examination in context is impossible. The stone is in 2 pieces in London. The temple it came from has not been excavated. The summit it sat on cannot be accessed. And the one-word dispute, not versus nothing, changes the meaning of the only physical artifact ever recovered from that summit. This is not a small problem. It is the central, unresolved problem of the physical case. Now look at what was not found at Qumran. 11 Aramaic manuscripts of 1 Enoch were buried in Cave 4. That number is significant for comparison. Scholars found only 1 copy each of Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. The Qumran community clearly treated 1 Enoch as critical material. But here is the gap that has never been explained. The Book of Parables, 1 Enoch chapters 37-71, is completely absent from Qumran. No fragments, no traces, nothing. 0. And the Book of Parables is the section of 1 Enoch most directly relevant to New Testament Christology, the section that most closely parallels the language Jesus uses about the Son of Man coming in glory. The community that preserved every other section of 1 Enoch apparently had no copies of the one section that aligns most precisely with what the New Testament would later teach. The absence is the problem. There is no agreed explanation. It could mean the parables were composed after the Qumran period. It could mean they belong to a different community entirely. It could mean something else. But the gap sits there in the manuscript record, unexplained, at the center of a text that was already excluded from the canon everyone else was building. And one more thing was found in that cave. 9 Aramaic manuscripts of a text called the Book of Giants, not included in 1 Enoch. Not preserved in any later tradition, found only at Qumran. The Book of Giants is what it sounds like, a continuation of the Watcher story, focused on the Nephilim, the offspring of the union between Watchers and human women, named figures, Oya and Haya. And the tone of this text is not triumphant. The giants in this document are terrified. They have dreams. In one dream, trees are cut down. Only one tree survives. They know what is coming. They send messages to Enoch asking for intercession because they understand their fate. This is prisoner literature. It reads like a condemned population waiting for a verdict. And then, in this same Aramaic text found in the Judean desert, the name Gilgamesh appears, the Mesopotamian hero, the ancient Sumerian king, in an Aramaic scroll buried near the Dead Sea, which means this tradition was not isolated. The Watcher story, the giants, the oath, the corruption of humanity, Something like this account was circulating across Mesopotamian, Israelite, and surrounding cultures simultaneously. These were not separate inventions. They were parallel memories of the same tradition. Go back to the mountain. The summit of Mount Hermon today is under Syrian military control. The southern slopes are under Israeli control, following the 1967 Six-Day War. The UN Disengagement Observer Force operates in the buffer zone between those positions. The mountain straddles three nations in active or unresolved military tension. The site of Qasr Antar, the temple, the ruins, the location where Warren stood in 1869, sits at the Syrian-controlled peak. No archaeological team has announced a comprehensive excavation of the summit. No published survey has updated Warren's 1,869 description of what is structurally present there. The last formal record of what sits at the top of the mountain 1 Enoch calls the landing site of 200 beings is 155 years old. The only physical artifact ever retrieved from that location is broken, in London, with a disputed translation. And the mountain itself produces something that makes the geography impossible to ignore. On another level, it is the primary source of the Jordan River. The snowmelt from its summit feeds the headwaters. Nations have gone to war over that water. 3 governments currently control pieces of its slopes. And at the very top, a ruined stone precinct that no modern researcher can reach. Now read what Jude and Peter actually wrote. Jude was written in the 1st century. Peter's 2nd epistle was written in the 1st century. Both reference the same event: angels who left their proper domain and were imprisoned in chains of darkness until the final judgment. Jude doesn't call it mythology. He cites Enoch by name, calls him a prophet, and quotes his words as authoritative. Tertullian, one of the most important early Christian writers, working around 200 CE, defended 1 Enoch as genuine scripture. Clement of Alexandria cited it as real. Irenaeus of Lyon, whose teacher's teacher was the Apostle John himself, referenced the transgression of the angels as factual theological background. For 200 years of early church history, the Watcher story was treated as something that actually happened. The shift came in the 4th and 5th centuries. Augustine rejected it. Jerome dismissed it. The Council of Laodicea in 363 CE excluded it. The canon hardened. 1 Enoch moved from authoritative source to non-canonical background text. But here is the problem that shift created. The quotes stayed in. Jude didn't get edited. 2. Peter's use of tartaro, a verb that only makes sense in reference to a tradition about imprisoned angels, stayed in. The language of Jude 6, about angels who abandoned their proper dwelling and are now kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness, is still in every Bible printed today. The source of that language was excluded. The language was not. They kept the quotation and removed the document being quoted. And the document being quoted named a specific mountain, with a specific event, with specific names, with a specific knowledge transfer, with a specific punishment site, with a specific etymology for the mountain's own name. This is not how symbolic religious literature usually operates. Symbols do not need rosters. Symbols do not need etymologies. Symbols do not need curriculum details about metallurgy and cosmetics. Symbols do not need desert coordinates with surface material specifications. This is how field documentation operates. This is how warning records operate. This is how someone writes when they want to communicate not what a thing means, but where it happened and what was done there. Now the stele sits in London. The mountain is behind a military buffer zone. The disputed word not hovers between 2 entirely different readings of the only physical artifact from that summit. And the Aramaic original of the text that started all of this is 80% lost. What survived did so in an Ethiopic translation of a Greek translation of a fragmentary Aramaic source. The chain is thin, but it held. Long enough to resurface in a desert cave in 1952, bearing a number 4, Q 201, and pointing north to a mountain that named itself after what happened there. The mainstream interpretation says it is metaphor, apocalyptic religious literature, a theological explanation for the origin of evil using angelic figures as narrative devices. And that reading is not wrong on its surface. If 1 Enoch is apocalyptic literature, it is not historical journalism. No one with serious credentials is claiming that 200 physical beings are currently chained under a desert opening. But the text did not choose vague mountains. It chose this one. It did not use generic evil figures. It named 20 of them with distinct assignments. It did not describe a spiritual darkness. It described rough and jagged rocks covering a face so that no light could reach it. It did not say somewhere in the desert. It said an opening in the desert, which is in Dudael. Specific location, specific material, specific condition, specific duration, until the day of the great judgment. One detail is a symbol, 2 details are coincidence. But a named mountain, a named leader, a numbered group, a sworn oath, a named etymology, a curriculum of specific technologies, a named punishment location, a physical description of its surface material, a light condition, a duration, and a surviving stone at the summit of that named mountain, with an inscription about an oath that is no longer metaphor behaving like geography. That is geography behaving like a record. The stone is at the British Museum. 2 pieces. The inscription is disputed. The summit where it was found is inaccessible. The text is 2,000 years old in its oldest surviving Aramaic fragment, and older by unknown years in its original composition. The mountain named in that text is still standing on the border of 3 countries, controlled by 3 governments, watched by a United Nations force established after a war. And at the very peak, in the ruins of the highest temple the ancient world ever built, there is a gap in the stone floor where a slab used to be. The official explanation says it was metaphor. The text says they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. The text has not changed. Only the interpretation did. And the mountain is still there.